We're going to go live right now to Mayor John Tory, who is speaking more about the proposed 2023 budget for the city. Let's listen in.
I've already been having some meetings with councillors, and some of them have already put forward some ideas that are not ideas that I find to be out of sync with what we're trying to do, which is to preserve city services and to make sure that we can serve people as best we can. But the process has, in fact, as you know, been underway for several months. And despite it being an election year, which has always led to some alteration of that timetable, there will be the opportunity starting today for there to be public and councillor input. The process that's been followed to date has been a collaborative process, as has been the case in every previous year between myself and Councillor Crawford and the professional public service. The differences between the process in my 8 prior budgets and this one are very, very few and very small in terms of the differences. I want to thank City Manager Paul Johnson, Chief Financial Officer Heather Taylor, Stephen Conforti, who's the Executive Director of the city's Financial Planning Division. If people out there had any idea as to the complexity of putting together a $16 billion budget, line by line by line by line, it is a massive undertaking, and the same, of course, with the capital budget. It is $16.16 billion operating budget and $49.26 billion capital budget as set out in a 10-year capital plan. Now, it's no secret that everyone is battling inflation, rising costs, and the lingering impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has made life harder for everybody. Chicken selling for $27 a kilogram is one of the latest public examples we've seen of rising costs that are faced by individual Torontonians. And people were shocked when they saw that. So was I. But on a city scale, we're seeing these things in different ways. So that, for example, our long-term care residences, of which we own 10, will face a $3 million increase to their food bill to care for the seniors that we have in our care. And that's a 31% increase. And this just goes on and on in terms of examples we face as a city government in trying to deal with the challenges of serving people. Another example is high fuel prices. Toronto residents have been experiencing this every time they fill up their car. Every 1 cent per litre increase in the price of gas cost the City of Toronto in its budget $900,000. The cost of fuel, for, if people think about it, for thousands of buses, police cars, ambulances, fire trucks, and many other city vehicles, that in and of itself, increased fuel costs will add $46 million to the city's budget for this year. And to put that into perspective, $46 million represents the equivalent of almost 1.5 points of property tax, just by itself, just for the fuel surtax, or not surtax, the fuel increase taking place. Rising interest rates, similarly, they've gone from 0.25% in 2021 to 4.25% today. So while they still sound low in a historical context, at 4.25%, this is way, way higher than it was a couple of years ago. And the fact is, for this year, that will add $65 million in increased capital financing costs in this budget. So despite the challenges of the current financial situation, the city staff have worked very hard to present a balanced budget. Most important to me from the beginning and today, at the beginning of the public part of this process, is that the balanced budget maintains frontline services and tries to keep cost increases that we put into place as low as we possibly can for Toronto residents. And this proposed budget does, in addition to all of that finding of savings and efficiencies, to all of that constraint with respect to taxes, allows us at the same time to make key investments. And we've made no secret about the fact the beginning of this exercise was maintaining frontline services, keeping the tax increases low, and then taking what money we did have that was additional money and applying that to priority areas identified to us by the people of the City of Toronto. And so we've worked hard to do all of that and to protect emergency services, in particular, that people do indicate to us are of very key importance to them, that people come when they're called and that they do as good a job as possible keeping the city safe in all respects. The proposed budget is the third one that includes the continuing impact on our finances of COVID-19. And that financial impact, of course, has been huge. It's cost the City of Toronto, COVID has, and you can measure it easily through reduced transit ridership and so on, increased sheltering costs. It has cost us a total of $5.5 billion since 2020. And I'm proud to have worked with both the federal and provincial governments to secure more than $3.5 billion in emergency COVID-19 support between 2020 and 2022. And we at the city have done our part as well, because we have found, through the hard work of our public servants, working in partnership with Councillor Crawford and myself, $2.5 billion in offsets and mitigation strategies to reduce the impact of the $5.5 billion imposed upon us by COVID. And that includes $669 million in savings, efficiencies, and mitigation strategies in this budget for 2023. I am determined to continue the work that I've been doing with the other governments to find a way to address the remaining $1.4 billion in pressures, $933 million for 2023, and the remaining $484 million remaining from 2022. And this is mostly, as you know, now due to the cost involved, the foregone revenue for us of reduced transit ridership, running at about 69 or 70%, and the expanded shelter system. Those discussions are challenging, but I'm very hopeful that the strength of our partnership with these governments and the strength of our case that an economically healthy Toronto is important not just to Toronto, but it's important to the entire country. I'm optimistic that those arguments and those strong partnerships that have existed will help us to get through dealing with these matters. We've separated out these items, as we've talked about last week, in the budget because they're clearly pandemic costs and because the other governments committed to helping us with those costs in their respective election campaigns, and because it is my job as mayor to stand up for Toronto and make sure that Canada's economic engine gets its fair share back from both the Government of Canada and from the Government of Ontario. As a city, I will say again, as I've said many times, that we're very grateful for the support that has been received to date, and now we just want to continue to work with those governments to see our country's largest city completely through the pandemic and its aftermath. And I would say to you again that yes, Toronto is different. There are people who resent hearing that, but the fact is that the scale and the complexity of what we deal with here, just on transit and housing alone, are things that warrant different treatment than other cities in the province or in the country. I'm very thankful for the ongoing support of the vast majority of councillors for our advocacy in this area. I don't believe it is a partisan issue, and I don't believe it should be a political issue. It's about making sure that Toronto residents and the city itself are supported and showing that we as a council are united in this effort to deal in partnership with the other governments who have been, by and large, good for us to deal with. I want to be clear and honest with people. We cannot bring this balanced budget forward without the shortfall that we face because of COVID being backstopped. On our own books, it has been up to the present backstopped, and we've discussed that before in the days leading up to this budget as well. But it is backstopped by funding that in many cases would otherwise have gone to our capital plan. The money that we have and receive in various different ways to build infrastructure and get projects completed. And these projects are good for the city in the longer term and also create jobs for people that are building them. I do not want to pause or cancel more projects in order to address this shortfall because I know this will have negative consequences on our city, short-term, longer-term, and on much-needed jobs. Just like in your own home, if you put off replacing the roof to pay the heating bill, it isn't a good long-term strategy for the health of your home. Now, throughout the election, I campaigned on keeping the operating budget property tax increase below the rate of inflation. And so you will see, as the budget is made public in just a few minutes from now, that the budget delivers on that promise with a 5.5% tax increase for the operating budget. That is below Toronto's present 6.6% inflation rate, but I recognize it is nonetheless a significant increase and that we're asking people to pay more. I wish it could be lower, because I know that any increased cost right now is hard for people to bear. I know many will come forward, as they do every budget year, and suggest taxes in Toronto are too low. In fact, I note with interest that councillors like Councillor Matlow and Councillor Perks have indicated we should have even higher tax increases. And I don't know whether that means 10, 12, 15%, but the bottom line is that, that this is something that does increase costs for people, this budget, but we have worked to keep those increases as low as we possibly can, because unlike them, that is the approach that I see as my responsibility, and in fact I made a commitment during the election to keep property taxes below the rate of inflation. The proposed budget also includes a below-inflation 3% increase for water, wastewater, and solid waste. And the budget also proposes to increase the municipal accommodation tax, they call it the hotel tax in some cases, for hotel stays, that tax being paid, of course, mainly by visitors to the city. This budget will be, at the same time, providing a $53 million transit subsidy increase from taxpayers, but that also is accompanied by a 10-cent fare increase that the Commission approved yesterday. That is a 3.1% increase below the rate of inflation and follows 2 years of fare freezes. Seniors and pass holders' fares are frozen, so they will not receive this increase, and 50,000 people will be added to the rolls of those eligible to get the fare pass discount for low-income riders. The budget will extend the City Building Fund so that the municipal government can continue to fund its fair share of major housing and transit capital investments, $6.2 billion over 10 years for these priorities. All of these measures will help to fund transit expansion and transit safety measures. They will help fund our efforts to get more housing built, including affordable and supportable housing. They will fund our efforts to invest in public safety, which is a crucial concern of many Torontonians, including police, Toronto Fire, EMS, along with increases for the Toronto Community Crisis Service. And that's something that, again, we should take note of. There's a significant increase called for the Toronto Community Crisis Service, and the public servants who are in charge of that program, I met with them yesterday, have strongly advocated to me that we not try to take this citywide too fast, because they want the chance to make sure it's working, and they gave me an update on that as recently as yesterday. And so when we talk about that, I'm all in favor of expanding that citywide as soon as possible, and as soon as we've made sure that the program is working and that we've made whatever changes and tweaks to it we have to do to make sure it works for those who are the ones we're trying to support, those who are experiencing mental illness. We've made more investments in anti-violence programs and more investments in outreach workers for our most vulnerable residents. The budget approved by the Police Board yesterday responds to the need for more officers to address 911 issues identified by the Auditor General and to address response times also commented on by the Auditor General. We saw a rise in carjackings and auto thefts and things like that last year, and the police responded to that. But you can't create special task force and groups of officers to address those kinds of concerns that have been registered loud and clear with us as elected representatives by the people we represent without having an impact on overall policing resources. Similarly, with the Missing and Missed Persons Report, we committed to hiring more officers to do case management. And this budget responds not just to that need, but also to that recommendation very clearly made to us by the Epstein report. The $4.45 billion 2023 capital budget released today, along with the 10-year, almost $50 billion capital plan, will show that we are continuing to make the billions of dollars of investments this year and over the next 10 years in areas like housing. This is the largest 10-year capital plan in the city's history, and it shows, thanks in large part to the City Building Fund, which I created a number of years ago, and our careful fiscal management over the last 8 years, that we are continuing, notwithstanding our financial challenges, to make the investments that we need to make in nuts and bolts infrastructure that a growing city needs. Our capital plan includes $9.8 billion for housing in a combination of direct city funding, $3.9 billion out of our own resources, and foregone revenues and land incentives totaling $5.9 billion to support rental development, emergency housing action, Housing Now, Toronto Community Housing Development Projects, and other housing projects. The proposed plan would commit an additional almost $1 billion in capital to be invested in housing efforts, along with $2.1 billion in additional funding for key infrastructure, including water, wastewater, libraries, and technology infrastructure. $700 million in additional funding for parks and community recreation facilities and flood protection in areas like Rockcliffe. $1.2 billion in additional funding for mobility, including investments in our transit fleet for new vehicles, investments in our roads, and the 4-year bike share expansion plan. A huge part of our capital plan delivers on the commitments we've made through our Transform TO Climate Action Plan. If approved, this capital plan will continue the work we're doing to reduce energy consumption and building emissions, invest in zero-emission vehicles, more in zero-emission vehicles, and a cleaner, greener TTC fleet, and respond to climate concerns with erosion control and wet weather resiliency. We are doing the work we need to do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and improve climate resiliency. These are challenging times for people. They're challenging times for governments too, but they're challenging times for the people we represent who pay the bills. And this is true in cities across Canada and across North America, not just Toronto. And our residents are not immune from the housing and homelessness crisis, for a growing concern that they have and that we have about public safety, a strained healthcare system, the lingering impact of COVID-19, and a growing affordability problem, not to mention the climate crisis. We are doing everything we can as a city, recognizing that it has to be done responsibly, that I stand here as mayor and Gary Crawford stands here as budget chief, not able to have the liberty of just saying, let's do this and let's do that and let's spend everything and do everything and promise everything to everybody. It's not the kind of mayor that I am. It's not the kind of mayor that I've been. People knew that when they re-elected me. But we're doing everything that we can to confront these challenges, and that work will continue. And I will conclude, before I call upon Councillor Crawford to say a few words, to simply repeat the principal objectives of this very challenging budget. And they are, first and foremost, as it has been from the first day we started on this, back in, I think, April, to maintain frontline services for people. Secondly, to address affordability issues by keeping the operating budget tax increase below the rate of inflation, which this budget proposes to do. Third, to invest new revenues that we do have, limited as they may be, responsibly and consistent with what the people have identified to us as their principal priorities to keep this city livable and affordable for them. And finally, to continue to work on a continuous basis to find whatever savings and efficiencies we can. I believe that this budget strikes the right balance between all of these objectives. Nonetheless, I do look forward to the input to come from the public and from the councillors as to how we might be able to make that balance that we've struck even better. I do look forward to hearing from the public and from colleagues. I've begun with that already. And I think that we can work our way through this process successfully and hopefully collaboratively in the weeks ahead. I just now want to begin by profoundly thanking Councillor Crawford. Again, you have no idea how hard our public servants work, and I thank them at the beginning of my remarks today to get to this day, and they will have, of course, a lot of hard work to do going forward at the beginning of the public process, but so too has Gary Crawford shown extraordinary leadership, and for somebody to keep this job and to be willing to keep it for 9 years is an extraordinary testament to his dedication to his job. And so I'll ask him if he'll say a few words on this day of introducing the budget.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. 9:30, a couple minutes from now, we'll be launching the budget at the Budget Committee. Mayor Tory quite aptly outlined the pressures facing our city. We're fighting multiple unprecedented financial crises and additional pressures as a city. In addition to the need to address the inflationary pressures impacting everything from food to gas to debt servicing charges, we are addressing ongoing significant COVID-19 pressures. Even as a city, we work towards recovery. These financial pressures continue in a very real way. Now, to address these challenges, we've worked hard to keep the tax rate below the rate of inflation. That includes solid waste and water fee increases, a single fare increase, which the TTC board approved yesterday, and as you can see this morning, a property tax increase of 5.5% for residential properties and a 2.75% for commercial properties. We have not asked Torontonians to make these sacrifices alone. And we have worked incredibly hard with the professional public service to find efficiencies where we have been able to. At the city, we have saved nearly $47 million through internal management of procurement strategies across our budgets. We've saved $6.6 million through modern TO to better utilize city office spaces. And we've saved over $1 million in credit card fees through digitization of our online payment portal for bills such as utilities and parking tickets. Now, these are just a few examples of the $289 million in efficiencies and expenditure actions that are in the budget for 2023. We have made and will continue to make prudent choices as a council to ensure that we maintain our AA credit rating, as we have done throughout the pandemic, without cutting the crucial services that the City of Toronto residents rely on. And while we work through this, our commitments are to build housing and, of course, transit. I want to thank the mayor for his tremendous leadership, particularly when it comes to the budget, for protecting city services. That's a commitment he has made not only in this budget, but in budgets in the past, and I just want to thank him for the incredible work. And there is a lot of work that happens behind the scenes to make that happen. I know he takes his responsibility as a mayor incredibly seriously, and that he works every budget year with me to make sure that we are doing all that we can to provide the vital municipal services we know residents want and need, and that we do everything that we can to provide careful fiscal management and stewardship that does keep increases as affordable as possible for the residents of this city. We'll now take some questions, and I'll pass it back over to the mayor.
And if you see Councillor Crawford exit out the back door, it's because he has to go to the committee and not because he's trying to leave me here by myself. Questions?
Mayor Tory, more than in previous years, the new strong mayor system makes this your budget. It really, you have ownership of it, you drafted it, and council needs a 2/3 majority to amend the budget. So are you going to be open to that since you have so much ownership of it?
I have already begun to sit down with councillors because I was starting to sort of brief them on some of what we've been talking about over the last days and this morning. And in the course of those discussions with some of the councillors, they've made suggestions about maybe we should do a bit more of this, or did you think about doing that? I am completely open to that. Now, we have some fiscal parameters within which we have to operate, and because I am not going to bend on having a tax increase that is below the rate of inflation, for example. I am not going to bend on cutting frontline services. But if there are things that we can do to make life better for people in the City of Toronto that can involve, some changes to the budget, that's why we have this public process that begins today, and that's why the actual budget that I will present for consideration to Council will, I'm sure, be slightly different than the one that we're presenting today. And so the answer to your question is yes, I'm very open to that, and I want to just find the best way we can to do things, but I have to be responsible about this because I'm accountable. I was accountable before. Even when I wasn't the so-called strong mayor, you would quite properly come and ask me questions about the budget and Councillor Crawford and say, well, this is your budget, you brought this forward, you're accountable for it, and I'm happy with that. But at the end of the day, I have to be responsible in achieving an appropriate balance between serving people and making sure we don't make the burden too high on them, and keeping taxes reasonable and generally prudently running the affairs of the city.
And on the COVID-related costs, I'm wondering at what point the city just starts to have to roll these costs into the budget every year for public health and transit. And when do you have to stop, frankly, accounting for them on a separate spreadsheet?
Sean, I think that's a very important question because, and I've raised before the possibility that, we may have seen changes in people's work habits such that transit ridership takes a long, long time, only fueled by growth, to come back to where it was in 2019. And so the question does arise, well, how long should the other governments and how long should we be making our plans on the basis that it will get back at some point to 100% of what it was? And so we're dealing with that, but I would say right now it is very fair to say that a big part of the transit ridership shortfall, for example, is occasioned by COVID and by the fact people are still uncertain about coming back on the transit, coming back to work, and so on. The employers still haven't said to people, we want you to come back to work, as a more sort of firm statement of their desire. And so during that period of time, I think it is perfectly appropriate and necessary for us to rely on the other governments to some extent to help us with that. And I'm not asking, notice I'm not asking for their help with things that are other than COVID. Yes, I want them to help with housing and with transit on the sort of construction capital financing side, which they've been doing. But on the operating side, I'm asking for help in this area of extraordinary COVID-related costs. But I understand there is a point in time where you'll have to say, well, COVID is over. And I don't think we're there yet, because I think we're just coming out of it now, and there's still some people that are suffering from either the direct impact of that or from the aftermath. So I don't think we're there yet, and that's why I've been continuing to press my case with the Government of Canada, and in particular, and also with the Government of Ontario.
This is the more important conversation, not when COVID is over, but that COVID is here to stay. Because I think that goes to the point we made about work from home. Nothing's changing in the short to medium term on that. Like, are we not at the point where the city has to say, these are a structural deficit. This is not something that we can kind of a one-off this year only, kind of next year only. This is now how it is.
Well, I think it's part of a much broader discussion. I'm certainly in no position, and I've spoken to a lot of employers, Oliver, and I've spoken to a lot of, speak to the medical officer of health all the time and so on. I'm not at a point where I can reach a conclusion as mayor, nor do I think can Councillor Crawford, about saying, COVID is over, it's here to stay, the effects are going to be as follows. I mean, I'm having many, many meetings, some of them in public view and others not, to try and get a grip on that, because I think anybody who suggests there's a simplistic answer to that is being simplistic, to be frank. I think we just have to come to grips with what people's work habits are going to be, what the evolution of that is going to be, what the health impacts are going to be in terms of people having distances between them, whether it's in a shelter or on a subway car. And those are very difficult questions to come up with an answer to. I haven't met anybody yet who says they have the answer to that, but we're dealing with it. And for this year, I would say it's too soon to say, well, we should have made all those changes ourselves on some kind of permanent basis to take account of something being permanent or not permanent. We've made adjustments for this year. We continue to make adjustments, but we continue to need the help of the other governments. And I'm still working hard, and I'm still, frankly, a bit puzzled by the challenge that's been posed by our discussions with the Government of Canada, especially in light, I'll say, of the fact that the Minister of Finance happens to come from Toronto. This is her city as well as mine. But having said all that, we'll keep working at that, and we will keep trying to find an answer to that question. It's a very profound question. What are people's work habits going to be? How much of that is related to COVID? How much of that is related to other societal changes that are taking place? And these are big questions. For us, it's questions involving hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on how you answer them. So I'm not going to answer them quickly based on some instinct I have or some study I read that somebody wrote up. I'm trying to source information and advice from everybody I can in dealing with questions that we'll have to deal with over the long term.
Can I just ask a clarification? Is it 5.5% property tax increase plus 1.5
Yes.
for the tax
Yes.
levy? So that's 7%. How is that below 6% rate of 6.6?
I've been very clear, and if you go back and check, Daryl, the
Matt.
I know, I'm kidding. If you go back and check, Matt, the words that I spoke during the election and that I've spoken for years have been that the operating budget increase, the city building fund has been for years shown separately to people on their tax bill as a long-term capital collection that we make for transit and housing, and has been shown separately and has been dealt with separately from the operating budget tax increase. And I think if you check the words I spoke and that were on my platform and on my website during the election, it was very, very clear in saying that, as I have been today.
Mayor Tory, a lot of people are going to open this property tax bill and be possibly quite upset. They're facing a lot of inflationary pressures. They're facing a TTC fare hike. Their trash is going up, their water's going up, everything's going up, their mortgages are going up, and then they open this bill. And in some cases, they may feel they're paying more for less because they're getting less TTC service. Even you talked about some services having to ban. So are you concerned that Torontonians are going to be very upset with this when they open those bills?
I know that when people open any bill from anybody, but including in particular from government, that they don't want to see increases at all, if possible, and that they don't want to see increases that are any bigger than they have to be. I would only note to those people that I understand the pressures you're under. I've said that repeatedly, but I also understand that if they want us to preserve and protect the frontline services, and in some cases enhance those services, as we're doing with emergency services, with safety issues for the police, the library budget is going up, the budget for housing is substantially up, the budget for transit is substantially up, in terms of what the taxpayers are paying, that if they want those services to be maintained or enhanced, there's a cost to that. And I've indicated very clearly how much our costs are going up too. You can't just say that fuel costs are going up $46 million and just sort of assume somehow we'll just eat that. You can't just say that our capital financing costs to build the infrastructure that keeps the roads paved and keeps the, park infrastructure and the splash pads working properly is going up by $65 million, and that we don't have to find a way to pay for that. So what I have done, as I committed to do during the election, I was very clear that there would likely be a tax increase. I just said during the election, and I'm keeping my word, that that tax increase for the operating budget would be below the rate of inflation, which it is. And I wish I could say everything was frozen in place. But the reality is that I can't do that and still protect the frontline services, and in many cases enhance some of those services to take account of other concerns people have, like public safety, things we have to do on the social side, housing, where we're making a substantial additional investment.
This is a question I hear from a lot of people, and it's, they've been living in a boom town for decades. Maybe it's not completely fair on a yearly basis, but the question is, where's the money going? Where's the benefit from all this boom if our taxes still have to go up at that rate?
Well, that raises an entirely different issue, which to me is how cities are financed. I mean, if we had a regime that isn't outdated, unfair, and unsustainable for big cities, including in particular the biggest city in the country, Toronto, to actually finance our operations, then we could maybe be having a different discussion about how we handle property taxes. But I would just say to people, if they want, and I believe most people do want, more police officers on the street, more investment in kids and families to make sure that we address the root causes of crime, more investment made in housing, especially affordable and supportive housing, more investment made in transit, including safety on the transit system, an increase brought about to the library budget, albeit modest, to make sure that we can continue there, as the public chief librarian said, with no service cuts this year. If they want all of that, which I believe they do, and I think if the city needs it to get back on its feet and boom again, as I think we're going to do, then we have to make these investments. And where the money is spent is very clearly set out in the budget. And the discussion we're going to have now will invite input from the residents and from the councillors as to areas where they think we should not be spending money we're spending, or we think it's misplaced and should be spent somewhere else. We've seen that discussion begin already. And that's fine. But where it's going is quite obvious in terms of the things that I've talked about over the last number of days that we're doing by way of the limited enhancements we're making to services, and most important of all, protecting services. If you knew the amount of time we spent in the room, mostly in that room there, over the last 9 months, finding out how, and I think you'll look at the services that we're providing to people and find that they are left uncut. Notwithstanding that, I had plenty of options put in front of me and Councillor Crawford to cut services, and we said no to basically all of them. Yeah, I mean, and that is because of a choice that we've made in terms of outlining the strategy we would have to adopt if we didn't get that assistance. You will know that we put in place some measures over the last couple of years of COVID to have a backstop so that we have some reserves that a prudent government would have in the event they said no. And so those are there to be used, but you can only use them once. And so that is why we said that even accompanying that or following that, we would have to cut capital. And that's only because I've made a choice between that or cutting operating, cutting services to people. I don't think we can afford to cut the fire service or cut the ambulance service or cut parks or cut, support to housing. So we've made a choice saying that in the initial going, if they don't come forward with the help that we've been asking for, we would have to cut capital. And that starts with postponing capital, and then in some cases we'd have to cancel things. And so the answer to your question is yes, that's where we've said we would do it in the initial instance. But I'm still working at making sure that that amount is preferably reduced to zero so that we get the help from the other governments to take the current remaining deficit, say for 2022, down from $448 million to zero. But we'll have to see how we do.
This budget assume that the Bill 23 cuts, the $20 million that's missing is paid for?
Yes. Well, because again, I have a letter. I just don't have some one conversation I had with the Premier or anybody else. I have a letter that says that the Government of Ontario is going to keep us whole for those amounts of money they took from us and left in the pockets of developers. Whatever you may think of that policy, that's what they did. And so they said they would keep us whole. And as you know, I'm now working on trying to get a precise definition of what keeping us whole means. But I'm assuming that it means what it's meant to mean. Keeping us whole means we're not at a dollar as a result of their change in policy, and that they will reimburse us for that. And certainly when I've raised that definition with everybody from the Premier through others in the government, they've never quarreled with that was the definition. But until I have an agreement with them on that, myself and other cities, we can't be 100% sure, but we've certainly proceeded on this budget to assume that they will keep their word and keep us whole.
I want to follow up on the question over there about capital. I mean, capital budget is huge, but $900 million is also not an insubstantial amount of money. What are we talking about when you say postponing or potentially canceling? Can you give us any example of the projects, anything that could be in that umbrella?
Well, we haven't looked at the 2023 list because, of course, we're just starting in with this year. And so looking back at 2022, though, the kinds of things that we did postpone as a matter of prudence so that we would not be left in a position where we'd sort of done everything we had to do in 2022 and then we're left, with the governments not coming through to help us, were a lot of local projects, frankly. There was no one big thing in there that sort of said, well, we're canceling this or canceling that. We just postponed some projects. And they, as I said the other day, they're projects that people notice locally because it means a road that was slated to be repaved in 2022 didn't get done, that kind of thing. But for 2023, we haven't developed a list, and obviously you're right, $900 million is a large number, but I'm very optimistic that we won't be left to deal with the entire $900 million. And of course, I would point out, we do have this backstop in place. And so the backstop doesn't all involve cutting capital. It involves some money that we've set aside consciously to make sure that when the proverbial rainy day came, that we were prepared, as any prudent financial manager would, to deal with a part of that on our own. And I've made very clear, by the way, so you know, to the other governments in my discussions with them, I'm not assuming that the request was they make up the entirety of last year's shortfall or this year's by themselves. In other words, that we not contribute to it. And so, we've had the discussions on that basis, but when you have one party that has not yet come to the table, it's difficult for us to determine what we're prepared to put in. The province has come to the table, and I commend them and thank them for that, because I think they were recognizing of the fact that the importance of this city to the provincial and national economy, and the importance of this city in and of itself being healthy and able to recover strongly, was requiring of support from the governments that collect income taxes, sales taxes, corporate taxes with grow the economy. It's not lost on me that those two governments are both running a surplus at the moment. We're not. It's not lost on me that this also reflects, as I said earlier on, a completely outdated Confederation era means of financing cities, this one being larger than most of the provinces of Canada. And so I just think that is an unsatisfactory state of affairs, and I'm going to have a lot more to say about that once we get the budget through, because I think we just can't go on this way. I mean, and others have said that before me, but I'm going to take it up as a project that's very important to me, together with mental health and others, in the remaining time that I have as mayor.
Speaker, when you say come to the table, you mean come to the table with money. I mean, the feds are at the table talking to you, right?
Yeah, but I mean, come, you can talk. There's been a lot of talk, months of talk, and that's been part of the problem, I guess, and there's been months of what I call this ping pong back and forth between the federal and provincial governments, but the bottom line is the provincial government has come to the table with $250 million odd, when I say about that number, that they're prepared to put in to address the remaining shortfall, and the federal government has not come forward with that, nothing so far.
But Mayor Tory, if there's been months of talk, surely they've indicated to you the sticking point, why they're not doing this, why it's not.
Well, I mean, I don't want to get too far into those discussions because they're, they're ongoing, but I will just say to you that there's been a lot of talk, as I just alluded to, as to the appropriate role of federal and provincial governments in assisting cities. Let's put it that way.
So they think the province should pony up more?
I'll leave you to conclude whatever you wish to conclude from that. I just don't want to get into, getting into the who said what to who, because it's not constructive, and we're still talking to them. And, I would hope that we have 25 members of the government that are from this city, and they've been good about being people that advocate on our behalf on housing and transit. And this is a case now for us to stand up together and say, and that's why I said that I hope the council could stay united on this. The economic health, the ability to recover of this city from the effects of COVID, and that's entirely what we're talking about here, is contingent upon having support from those other governments. And it is in the best interest of the government of Canada and Canada as a whole that this city should recover strongly and be put on a better footing. And that's why I think it's important for the government of Canada to do more. And I'll acknowledge they've done a lot. They've done a lot. I'm prepared to stand up here one day, if you like, in public, or if they like, and catalog the whole thing. But at the end of the day, it's not quite enough to get us to where we need to be healthy and strong, and to be able to recover strongly in the best interest of Canada, not just the residents of Toronto.
Are you getting pulled into the jurisdictional bun fight between the province and the federal government over healthcare funding?
No. Well, look, all these things are factors that relate to some degree of, I'll call it, tension between the governments where they're having these ongoing debates. So I can't say, because I don't know, that it's unrelated entirely to discussions about what they would do on COVID. So it could be that, but I'm not getting dragged into it. I'm just saying it may be something that's going on alongside of this, and so it impacts on how they deal with me on behalf of the City of Toronto and other cities from around the country. I can't say, though, they've never sort of said that to me and raised it directly. Don't know. Anything else?
Mayor Tory, how about the possible tax levy on parking lots for malls?
It's so interesting the way politics is played out, and so much of it I hope you can sort of penetrate some of the theatrics that go on. I mean, I have asked, as mayor, for 2 reports on that, one about 2017 and another one maybe in 2020. And when I asked for the report, they raised a whole lot of questions that don't make it as simple as some of these people are suggesting, is just you just implement it and it produces magically hundreds of millions of dollars. I'll tell you some of the questions going from memory from those reports. How do you deal with churches? Do you put a parking lot? A lot of churches have big parking lots. Do you tax those? How about small retail plazas that are all over the suburban parts of the city? Do you tax those differently as you would tax Yorkdale or Fairview Mall? How about, the question of administration? How about the experience in Vancouver? These are all cataloged in those reports, where in Vancouver they brought such a thing in, and I think they eventually abandoned it. You can check me on that, because it didn't produce anywhere near as much money as they said. And so you see, this is the position you find yourself in when you're the mayor, is that, and I guess I conduct myself as mayor, I hope, in a way that acts responsibly. And doesn't just say, sure, let's have a parking levy and it's going to raise now the number's up to $500 million. It was never anywhere close to that in estimates made by our own public service. But people, for political reasons, have inflated the number now to $500 million that will, just like that, the drop of a hat, just bring it in and the money will start pouring in tomorrow. The reports indicated it would take 2 years. Now, I think that was a bit long. 2 years to implement it administratively, because you can imagine if you're having all these exemptions for small plazas, for churches, it's going to be an administrative nightmare. Small business spoke up when this was even on the possibility list, because it's in the City of Toronto Act, and sort of said, well, we have grave concerns about that. If we have 2 parking spaces behind our business, as a lot of stores do, are you going to tax those when small business is just starting to recover from the pandemic? And so I've never said I was against this. It is a tool that's in the City of Toronto Act, but I just will continue to conduct myself as mayor, notwithstanding the way these people posture, quite frankly, and say this could just be done at the drop of a hat if only the mayor wanted to listen. I've asked for and received 2 reports. Please go and read them. and you'll see that they have plenty of complexities which just don't make it an easy thing to do, and that's not the responsible way to run the government. And I won't run the government that way. I have 3.5 years left. I'm not going to turn myself into somebody that's irresponsible at this stage and just say, yeah, sure, let's do that. I never have, and I'm not going to do it. People don't expect that of me. They re-elected me because I'm not that way, and let the other people do that. That's up to them. They're politicking, it's theatrics, and I'm not going to be part of it.
So you don't do it because it's complicated or because it doesn't make sense?
No, I have never said it doesn't make sense. What I have said is that I read the reports written by our professional public servants, not one report but two, saying it is a massively complicated thing, first and foremost. And secondly, it's certainly those reports called into question whether it would raise as much money as would make it worthwhile to implement it. In other words, they pointed to the experience, I believe, in Vancouver and sort of said that it didn't quite live up to what it was billed out there as being put in place to do. And so I'm simply saying if we're going to do it, then we have to do it carefully and address a lot of these concerns that have been raised twice in public service reports that caused us to, sort of back off and not say we would proceed ahead aggressively, just to say, yeah, sure, let's do that. So I'm not saying it doesn't make sense. I'm saying there's a lot of concerns that have been raised in those reports that would have to be addressed before you could implement it, practically and take in a dime, let alone, make sure you didn't damage, people in the meantime, including people like small business or churches, just to name two examples. But please go and read those reports. They're there. They've been there for, pardon me, for years.
Well, we've been
just sort of
listening to
forget about
Mayor
these
John
things
Tory
because they
alongside
drift
Budget
off
Chief
the
Gary
list of time.
Crawford getting some details about the proposed budget for the city for 2023 today, announcing a 5.5% property tax increase, 7.5% for commercial properties. The budget process is complicated this year by a shortfall of about $900 million, and Mayor John Tory has promised homeowners won't see their property taxes increase by more than the rate of inflation. However, it is going up 5.5%. And today's big picture outlook follows the release of some priority items in recent days, including the TTC board's approval of a budget proposal that comes with a fare hike and service cuts. It includes a fare increase of 10 cents for adults and youth. Seniors and those with monthly passes would be exempt, while children 12 and younger would continue to ride for free. The fare hike is expected to generate more than $16 million. The proposal would also see service hours reduced to 91% of what they were before COVID. And the Toronto Police Services Board has unanimously approved a nearly $50 million increase to their services budget. The money would be used to hire 200 additional officers and pay for programming aimed at addressing youth violence. Police Chief Myron Demkew says the extra $48.3 million is necessary to improve response times and boost the presence of officers downtown. But it appears the police budget will be a particularly contentious debate. An open letter signed by 7 newly elected city councillors opposes the increase and calls for further investments in social services to help reduce crime. The letter reads, in part, for too long, governments have prioritized enforcement over addressing the root causes of crime and violence, poverty, discrimination, lack of opportunities, underinvestment, and inequality. Well, the budget requires approval by City Council, but Mayor John Tory can use his new strong mayor powers to veto any changes Council makes. Council will vote on February 14th.